Chapter 1. The Beginnings of a Small Life. Who am I, and where did I come from? Has this question ever come to your mind? For me, this question became a road that was a mystery and a great question mark. I pondered all kinds of things across a broad spectrum of thought. Some things troubled me more than others. There are many wonderful things in the world, but is there something that will answer the question of the purpose of life? I was born in the Polish countryside. It was an idyllic environment to grow up in. I am the first fruit of love, the eldest child. My parents got married on May 1st, 1965, and I was born exactly a year later on May 1st, 1966. I was conceived in the beautiful landscapes of Gobalovka in Zakopane on my parents' honeymoon. This must be the reason I love mountains. And I have visited this landscape often. Something keeps drawing me there. I only recently heard from my parents that that's where I was conceived. They told it to me when I took them to visit there. The first years of my life were not easy. My first home was a building that was attached to my grandparents' hay barn and made of planks and insulated with sawdust. That's where we lived, me, my parents, and my brother Robert, who was 1.5 years younger than me. Love carried us through our difficult life situation. My grandparents' house, situated in the same yard, was a typical building of the time that had a space for animals on one end and living quarters for people at the other. The people's end of the house was painted light blue and the other end was made of logs. In addition to my grandparents, my father's oldest sister lived there. It meant that there was little room in the house, and the lifestyle of the young family didn't always fit in with the style of my grandparents. This created conflicts, and therefore living in separate quarters was a better option for everyone. My parents decided to build their own proper home nearby. After all, a sawdust house was not proper accommodation for a family with children. My grandfather loved me much, but I was only 6 years old when he died. I had often sat in my granddad's lap on a wooden bench in front of the old house, and together we watched the life happening around us. Directly in front of the house, a lovely green meadow spread out. It rose up like a beautifully and skillfully woven carpet up towards a high hill. A small stream ran around the hill. It twisted and turned and flowed through our farmland to a river. Most of the time, the stream was calm, and the water in it was crystal clear, clean and good. We watched my mother herding a couple of cows towards the hill between a narrow country road and fields. On the way, the animals stopped by the stream and contentedly drank the fresh water. Then, refreshed, they headed up the hill, happily swishing their tails. Grandma came out of the house and grabbed the willow broom that leant against the wall. She used the broom with rigor, making dry debris dance around and settle in a heap. The chickens came out of curiosity to see whether the newly formed heap of debris contained any goodies. They pecked and kicked the pile, dispersing it and making Grandma angry. "Shoo!" Grandma shouted, and threw the broom from her hand towards the chickens. The chickens jumped up, giving a painful screech, and ran off. Grandma finished her job and slipped back into the house through its low door. The sound of turkeys and geese from the neighbor's yard caught my and Granddad's attention. A couple of horses came out of the neighbor's barn with their master. The neighbor rigged the horses for plowing and lifted the plow onto a wooden cart and left for field work. He went a few meters from his yard towards the road that passed by the spot Granddad and I were sitting in, and stopped. "Brrr," he said to his horse, pulling the reins towards himself. "God bless you," he said, speaking in our direction. "God bless you," my Granddad replied. They had a brief exchange of how-do-you-dos, and the neighbor went on his way. We watched the horses tread the dry, sun-parched field path, raising clouds of dust as they went. They also stopped at the stream by the bridge and immersed their thirsty noses into the water. Then they picked up speed for going uphill. The sun and birdsong were soothing to the senses, and I sat in Granddad's lap enjoying his stories and presence. I felt loved and happy. I loved Granddad very much, but I didn't get to enjoy these moments for very long because he died on Christmas Eve. His death felt incomprehensible to me. I walked around the open casket and asked him to get up, but that was a sleep he didn't wake from. Dad finished building the ground floor of our house and we moved in. The building work progressed slowly because it required money and Dad had another job. One day, we were playing alone with my little brother, and I wanted to get better acquainted with the family medicine cabinet. It was nailed to the wall in a corner. I took some of Dad's heart meds and put them in my mouth like sweets. I tried to put some in my brother's mouth, but he spat them out. They seemed to be to my taste, though, since I ate quite a lot of them. My parents were shocked when they realized what had happened. I started losing consciousness. The village priest, who was also a doctor and a highly respected authority, was called in. He poured some medicine in my mouth and said that all we could do was wait. For 3 days, I was only half conscious. The whole family prayed for me, and Jesus heard us. He had other plans for me and didn't leave me to die. On the 3rd day after taking the meds, my strength returned and I was able to stand on my feet. The whole family and all the neighbors were overjoyed and thanked God for the miracle, for it had been possible that my earthly journey had ended there. Yes, why would my life have ended so soon? Would it have been a coincidence? Would it have been God's will or someone else's? Would I have gone to be with my granddad wherever he had gone? And where did he go? I was told that Granddad went to heaven. Is that where I would have seen him? He was in a casket, and he had been placed in a deep hole, a grave. Is this how I would have gone to heaven, like my granddad? But it wasn't my time to cross the border to the other side. I often pondered this question later, when my mother told us this story. Death with its scythe had come close, but someone didn't hand me over. The battle between life and death went on. What if I hadn't been born of my mother and father? Would I exist at all as I am if my parents had been different people? They say that there are no coincidences in life, so everyone has to be born of certain people in order to be who they are. Both my mother and my father came near to death when they were young. Dad was born in 1935, so he was old enough to remember the terrors of the Second World War. There was a partisan unit near our village that fought against the overwhelming German army with small weapons. My aunt Mila was often with them, transporting grenades and weapons in willow baskets under the potatoes for the partisans. One day, when Granddad wasn't home, some German soldiers came in and asked where he was. My grandma's explanations didn't convince them, and they thought he was a partisan and was in the woods with the others. So they took my grandma and the 2 younger children who were there with her with them. The children were my dad and his little sister Maricia, who was to become my godmother. My grandma held the smaller child in her arms as she and my dad were made to stand facing a wall and had a gun placed against their backs. Just as the soldiers were about to shoot, another German soldier drove up at speed, shouting that they needed to hurry and come now, because the Russians were breaking through their defenses with overwhelming force in the battleground nearby. The executioners left the woman and her children in order to run. My mother was also close to death a couple of times when she was young. She told me about the time when she had been 9 and on the way to school. She and some other kids had got a ride in a horse-drawn wagon loaded with wet and heavy sand and stones from the river. The children pushed and shoved each other, and she fell out of the wagon straight under one of the wheels, and it rolled over her middle. The driver didn't even stop, but left the unconscious child lying there. The other children told the teacher at school what had happened. The teacher found an old baby's pram from somewhere and went to help the unconscious child. Meanwhile, someone had told my mother's father what had happened, and he rushed over to help, leaving his work behind. My mother was treated in hospital for some time, but lived, and no part of her body was permanently damaged. A few years later, death was stalking her again. She was going home from school at the age of 16 with some school friends. The girls parted company, and my mother continued walking towards a ravine with a path through it. She admired the beautiful forested landscape around her, but her walk was interrupted by a strange man who grabbed her and started choking her with all his strength and ripping her clothes off. My mother screamed at the top of her voice and tried to free herself, but the man didn't let go. A priest nearby heard the screams and ran to help, and the attacker fled. God is never late, and his angels were vigilant again. A few years passed, and my mother met my father, a dark, handsome, musical man. After they got married, my mother moved from the top of the hill to the valley a few kilometers lower down by the river. So we lived in a valley by a river embraced by high hills on both sides. The houses were mostly built on either side of the river, but some were on the slopes and on top of the hills. Tall oaks, acacias, linden, and many other trees thrived in the area. Some of the hills were tilled, but there were also places with such difficult terrain that only the herders with cows or sheep could access it. Flowering meadows gleamed in multicolor, and the scent carried far. Bees kept themselves busy, and many farmers had honey. The main livelihood was agriculture, even though the area was challenging for arable farming. Before, when everything was done with horses, it was relatively safe. But as tractors became more into use, it became fatal for a few farmers. Big machinery was not suited for places that were so steep, and they were prone to topple over. Our farm work was also carried out in constant fear of Dad not coming back from the fields alive. Many times the tractor slipped all the way down the slope, especially after rain. I often wondered at my dad's bravery when I watched with trepidation how he went around the field over and over, cutting wheat or other grain into bunches suitable for tying into sheaves. The work took long, and I felt it would never end. The sun was already setting, and it brought a cool breeze to the end of the hot day, but we had to get the job done. When the hay and the grain had been harvested, it was time to pull up the potatoes, sugar beet, and other vegetables. Sometimes I went with my aunt, my father's oldest sister, to herd cows and listen to her stories. I liked her a lot because she had time for me, and she also taught me card games and various versions of patience. Sometimes my aunt went to work for her own aunt in the town of Tarno. She helped her in a kiosk that sold bric-a-brac. Later she found employment as a domestic aide with a doctor's family, and after that she rarely visited us. But when she did come, she always brought something. I was 10 years old when I was allowed to care for my youngest brother. I had 3 brothers at the time. After Mum had left to work in the fields and Dad had gone to his paid job, we thought of things to do. We were never bored because we always came up with diverse, fun things to play. My brother, who was 1.5 years younger than me, was called Robert, and his second name was Wojciech. Mariusz was 4 years younger than me, and Tomasz 7. It is common in Poland to invent nicknames based on children's proper names, and so my brothers were called Wojtek, Marek, and Tomek. We played outside a lot, as spring and summer are usually sunny and warm in Poland. We didn't have many toys, but everything around us served well as a playground and play equipment. Once we noticed a herd of geese that left the neighbor's yard and came to the front of our house. We thought it was fun, and we closed the gate, taking the geese prisoner. I wanted to give them something to eat and left the boys waiting outside while I went to the storage boxes upstairs to get some grain. The house had grown by another story and a half, so there were lots of stairs. I heard shouting and crying from the hay barn and came back down into the yard quickly. I threw the dish of grain out of my hands and rushed to see what had happened. The 2 elder boys had lifted up the heavy barn doors being kept inside the barn, and they had fallen over. I ran closer and saw the terrible reality. Tomek lay unconscious and bloody under the doors. He was only a little 3-year-old boy, and the doors were big and heavy. I quickly took him up in my arms and, in complete shock, I carried him towards the field where my mother was working. One of the boys ran ahead of me and got Mum to meet me halfway. With my last strength, I carried the limp little child. Blood ran from his ears, mouth, nose, and the middle of his forehead. Even his eyes were bleeding. Mother came up to us running and quickly took the boy in her arms. She spoke to me, crying and shouting at the same time. "Go to Daddy quickly. He's working on the building site by the culture center today. And tell him to come quickly, because we need to get Tomek to hospital urgently." She was close to panicking herself. I ran as fast as I could. Dad dropped everything and got on his motorbike that he used to get to work. We got home fast. Mum had meanwhile got ready to go to hospital. She wrapped the child in a towel and a blanket, and Mum and Dad disappeared from our sight at speed. The rest of us stayed at home, crying, with our hearts full of grief and fear, waiting to see what would happen. Guilt and disappointment about not being able to protect Tomek, and the thought that he could die because of this my mistake overtook me. I cried inconsolably, and the neighbour's girl who came to stay with us was unable to comfort me. The hours stretched out indefinitely, and grief gnawed at me to the deepest reaches of my soul. Then we heard the sound of a familiar motorbike. Our parents had come home without my brother because he had to stay in hospital. The situation was serious, and the whole family went to prayer. We visited the little patient in hospital often. Day by day he got stronger, and soon he returned home with a large scar above his eyebrows for a reminder. But that was inconsequential now. The main thing was he was all right. Life returned to its usual routine. Zepinik Marsizewski was the name of our village. Our village and those around it, differentiated only by the signs outside them with their names on, were a quiet area. Good relations with neighbours and respect for all residents were valued. Mum often baked bread and then cut a piece of the best one and sent one of us kids to take a piece of warm bread with its fresh scent to our closest neighbour. They would reciprocate with a taste of their baking too. Our best relations were with our closest neighbours. They had the same surname as us, but we weren't related. We helped each other much, and we were good friends. If we had an accident or anything at all, we ran to them, and they came to us. All of us did heavy labour. I sometimes looked at the sun-baked fields through a window. The women would be weeding the potato fields, and the men worked horses to clear the furrows between the potato ridges. Chickens, geese, turkeys, ducks, and other small farm animals wandered freely around the houses, making all cacophony of noises. Mum slaughtered a chicken because it was Saturday, and we were meant to have something special to serve at table on Sunday. Dad gathered his things and placed his accordion on his shoulders. He was going to sing and play his accordion with his orchestra. There was a wedding somewhere further away that weekend. The orchestra had already gained some popularity, and they had a fairly full schedule. The men spent a lot of time practicing new pieces, sometimes till the early hours of the morning. Sometimes the fatigue of the day job combined with a long night made it so that it could be hard to remember a particular song. Then Dad would wake me up and ask me to sing that song to them, and I sang. Glad of the reminder, the orchestra continued practicing, and I went back to bed. The loud music didn't bother us or prevent us from falling asleep, because we had been used to it ever since we were very little. My granddad had also played the violin and the clarinet when I was only a baby, so to me it was like a lullaby. But not everything about my father's hobby was all good, and mixed feelings often overtook a small girl's mind. On the one hand, it was lovely that Dad had managed to earn a little extra money for us and brought various cakes and biscuits home. They tasted wonderful at a time when few sweets were on sale at the shops, and we wouldn't have been able to afford them anyway. And cleaning the car the next day was exciting, because whoever found any money, mostly coins, that had fallen on the floor from the orchestra's instruments was allowed to keep it. It was the custom in Poland to make requests to the orchestra, and whoever made the request would put money in the instruments and the orchestra members' pockets. These would fall on the car floor on the way home, and the drunk musicians didn't think to look for them inside the car. That was our wage for cleaning the vehicle. But on the other hand, fear and terror was on our minds because we knew that Dad would sometimes drink and drive. When evening came, and we had all bathed in a lovely Saturday bath for the weekend, we went to watch TV in our parents' bedroom. Mum switched it off and said, "Now we pray." We prayed together almost every night. But now, when Dad wasn't with us because he was on a gig somewhere, we feared that he might be drinking and driving, and we were serious about what we prayed. I heard Mum crying quietly, and I asked, "Mum, what is it? Why are you crying?" "It's nothing," she replied, and quickly wiped her tears. "I wonder how Dad will come home," she said. Uncertainty and tiredness overcame us, and we fell asleep. Mum enjoyed handicrafts, and cross-stitch was her hobby. At that time, she worked on a cross-stitch pattern that reflected the fears and anxieties she felt inside. The stitch work she was doing was pendant-shaped, and it had a big picture that resembled a cocktail or wine glass in the middle. The text, "Death in a Goblet," was written in large letters on it. I remember that pendant hanging on the wall in our home for years. Dad often came home in the early hours of the morning, but sometimes not until morning proper, when people were going to church already. I watched from the window as he got out of the car and wandered around it, came up and went straight to bed. I often went to early morning service. Mum usually went to the 10:30 service with the younger children. All the villagers attended church, as many as were able. We were a very religious community, and going to church was taken for granted. The church was built on slightly higher ground than our house. It was further from the river, whilst our house was only a few tens of meters from its banks. The peaceful and shallow river with clear water often turned into a huge flood monster that took anything in its path away with it. Massive muddy bodies of water came from upriver with a whoosh, and the river banks couldn't contain the volume of water and gave way. The mass of water overflowed the banks, toppling trees like they were mere sticks. The water moved along anything that was in its path: animals, farm machinery, grave candles, sometimes even people. The warning siren would sound and everyone would rush to save what they could. One of our dogs drowned in one of those floods. Having raved for a time, the river would settle back within its banks and return to its normal state as a bubbling stream of clear water. Clearing after the flood always took time. Everywhere was covered in a thick layer of mud and dirt, and we even had to shovel it out of the ground floor of our house. People went looking for things and sometimes found them quite a distance away. The church was in the next village, even though it was close to the center of our village. It only took me less than 10 minutes to walk there. A stream of people made their way to the church as it got closer to the time the service would begin. An impressively large church bell sounded loudly when it was time to announce the beginning of Mass or some other church service. We met friends and acquaintances on the way and exchanged how-do-you-dos. Everyone wore their Sunday best, a clean and finely set outfit according to their means. The women usually sat in the left side of the church and the men to the right. The pews in the middle were taken by older people and women. Children sat in the first row. I also often sat there, or possibly in one of the bays. The side altars were in the bays. There was a gold-gilded statue of St. Joseph in the left-hand bay. He held a little baby Jesus in his arms. There was an equally large statue of Mary in the other one. There was a picture of the merciful Jesus by her feet, which was relatively small compared to the other statues. The Jesus in that picture caught my attention the most for some reason. It was close to my heart. The same picture was sometimes taken from house to house, and people followed it, singing and praying. Dad taught me and my brothers Christian songs and made us sing with him. He taught us to sing in harmony, and we sang for people and for the glory of God, with him accompanying us on his accordion. People praised us for singing beautifully, even though I felt extremely nervous. That picture of Jesus often caught my attention, and sometimes I felt like it was alive. I loved that picture of the merciful Jesus and had a deep respect for it, as I did for everything to do with the Catholic Church. The priest came out of the sacristy, and there were many church boys in front and behind him. We all stood up, and the cantor played the organ and sang loudly. The early morning Mass didn't usually have a choir. The choir, which my parents were also in, sang for greater holidays and was accompanied by a wind instrument orchestra. It was so grandiose. The priest started the Mass and everyone sat down. Whilst he spoke, I watched him strangely biting his teeth. It looked like he had been chewing gum, even though we had never known of it at the time. Everything was very ritual, the same every Sunday, even though the chapter from the Holy Word changed. That was the Holy Word, the priest would say, and raise a large, decorative book up in his hands after he had first kissed it. All of it was so far from us and felt so unreachable and difficult to understand. It was like a wonderful story that apparently had happened at some time. The ritual was shiny and fine and distant, but respect-inspiring. I looked at the huge black statue of Jesus above the altar. He sat with his head down, a crown of thorns on his head, drops of blood on his cheeks and feet. He leaned on his hand, and the other hand held one leg. It was an impressive sight and a fine piece of art. All he was wearing was a piece of cloth around his loins. Our family was very active concerning anything to do with the church. Dad had helped to build it. When it was Mum's turn to clean it, she got the flowers from our garden, or we saved money to buy them. The children participated in various tasks from a young age. The boys were often church boys, and the girls would, for example, strew flowers under the priest's feet in the seasonal festivities that were held for a certain time in June. The priest, carrying Jesus in the form of communion bread, walked along this carpet of flowers, and everyone else followed him. When a girl grew older, she was promoted to carrying a pillow with an object on it. For a few years, I carried a pillow with Jesus' crown on it. Teenage girls got to carry bigger pictures that required 4 people to bear them up on long poles. Adult women carried the largest and heaviest statues and pictures of saints. We went around the church singing and praying to the accompaniment of the wind orchestra, and returned to the church, where the Mass continued. The members of the orchestra were dressed in Krakow local national costume. They had red, square hats decorated with long, beautiful pheasant feathers. There was a grand atmosphere of celebration. As I walked around the church, I often surveyed the beautiful flower beds that had been skillfully chosen and planted around the church. The lawns around the church and the path made of concrete slabs were always neat and tidy. And when it was time for the procession, the concrete slabs were transformed into a carpet of flowers. The parsonage was at the back of the church, and its surroundings were kept meticulously neat. There was a huge statue of Mary between the church and the parsonage. A covering resembling a half sphere had been skillfully built around it. It doubled as an outdoor altar. It was decorated with flowers and beautiful bushes. Above the main door to the church, there was a statue of Jesus surrounded by sheep that were walking towards him on paths, as it were. It wasn't a big church, but it was well built and decorated with handmade art. There was a pathway of different trees, bushes, and flowers that led up to the church, and the concrete steps that had led to the front yard of the church. Access to this pathway was from between huge oaks that grew on either side of it, as if they had been soldiers stoutly distinguishing the asphalt path from the church grounds. There was a graveyard near the church on the other side of the river bank. The area was covered in tombs, statues, trees, and bushes. People took flowers, lanterns, and candles there in remembrance of Granddad or Grandma and other relatives, especially on All Saints' Day. The church service ended, and we would crowd towards the exits. On our way out, we would once more dip our fingers in holy water from a vessel attached to the wall. We would form the cross on ourselves, leaving a drop of water on our foreheads. We were always cheerful on the way home, walking with neighbors or friends and talking avidly. It felt good, because the main duty of Sunday had been performed. Mum also came back from the church and busied herself preparing Sunday dinner. Dad was still asleep, and we began cleaning the car. We put the coins we found in the car in our pockets with a feeling of satisfaction. The day for buying sweets was approaching. Often we also had guests on a Sunday, mostly relatives from either side of the family. The most usual guest was Dad's youngest sister and her family. I was glad of their visits, because they had 2 girls approximately my age, and I got to play girls' things with them. Lucina was 2 years older than me, and Cassia was 2 years younger. I admired their fine city clothes and shoes. Their mother, who was also my godmother, was a shop assistant in a shoe store. Sometimes we were able to buy better shoes using a coupon when Auntie saved some up for us. We ate dinner together, and I enjoyed the company of the girls. They became good friends to me. At first, I had a lot in common with the elder girl, but when she became interested in boys, the younger one became closer to me. Even so, we did spend a lot of time together with both of them. Parting was painful for me. I often cried when they went home, but one had to accept it and get on with life. The next day was ordinary again: school, work, and responsibility for my younger brothers. But something nice was coming. The school holidays were approaching, and my cousins would be coming to stay for a couple of weeks. I was full of energy, and everything seemed to be better. The previous summer, I had spent a week visiting my Aunt Mila at her workplace for the first time. She was a maid for a doctor and his family in town. They had a girl and a boy who were almost my age, and I enjoyed being there. With them, I saw no poverty, and I didn't need to do heavy work or take responsibility for my younger siblings. I could just enjoy the summer. The father taught and coached his children at swimming and asked whether I would like to join his kids. And, of course, I gladly agreed. Our river wasn't suited to swimming because there were treacherous deep whirlpools here and there in the stream. The water flowed straight from the mountains and the hills nearby, rushing downstream to join the larger river, the Biala. On beautiful summer days, the river was clear and cool. It often transported debris and household waste, acting as a general dump. But even that didn't stop us kids going swimming and playing there on a hot summer day for lack of anywhere better to go. The indoor and outdoor swimming pools in the city felt wonderful. The warm pool was a luxury. I couldn't swim properly yet, so the coach got me swimming aids and I began to learn. I was quick to learn, and in a few days I was diving around without swimming aids. While the coach taught the others, I played on my own in the pool without attracting attention. I wanted to try how you might get up from the bottom of the pool by interweaving myself between the rungs of the pool ladder. So I did. All was well until something caught my bikini bottoms and wouldn't come undone. I thrashed about, but it didn't help. Then I looked to see what was wrong and saw a long screw sticking out of the ladder. I got myself free and came up. They had already started to search for me. The father of the family shouted at me anxiously, "Where were you so long? We've been looking for you everywhere. What if you had drowned?" I told him what had happened, but it didn't calm him. I had been in a place where they couldn't see me from above. I have no idea how long I was underwater, but practicing holding my breath in the sink at home came in useful. And probably God had intervened once again to help me, because there really is no other explanation. I had a terrible fright myself, and my swimming career ended there. I have never seen that family since then. There were no girls my age in my neighborhood. There were more boys. I sometimes met the daughter of the school teacher who was 7 years younger than me. I had a sturdy bicycle that I liked to ride, and I often took the girl along. We would walk up the hill to our house, she would sit on the back, and we would ride the downhill. But one time, she got on the handlebars, and we started our ride. Just as we got past our house at speed, something went wrong and we fell over. We both got hurt, but she was hurt worse than me. We were covered in cuts and bruises. I got told off by both my own and her parents. One summer day, we went to play by the river. The river had once again carved out a deeper bend for itself by a large tree, and a sandbank arose on the opposite side. That's where we played, collecting special stones and building things out of them. I was deeply concentrating on something I was doing with the stones, squatting facing the riverbank, and my friend was behind me collecting stones. Then I heard a strange sound, and when I turned around, I couldn't see her. A moment later, she appeared above the water, gasping for air, with her curly blonde hair wrapped around her face. Then she disappeared again. The water had made a deep hole in the spot where she was, and she had fallen in. A whirlpool had formed there, and it drew everything to the bottom. As soon as she had disappeared, I jumped in after her. I saw her lifeless under the water, stuck to the roots of a tree by her hair. The water had worn away at the shore and revealed tree roots, with their sharp ends left sticking out into the water in all directions. I swam towards her and started tearing her hair off the tree roots. I worked fast and got her to the shore. I placed the pale girl on the sand and pressed her chest a few times like they had taught me to do in swimming school. She vomited some water, and I placed her on her side. She started breathing but remained unconscious. I took her in my arms and carried her high up the bank to her home. The girl's parents came to the door, and a great cry and moaning began when they saw their limp daughter in my arms. "What have you done to her?" There was no time to explain, and I couldn't find the right words. I got even more scared and ran over the bridge home crying. An event like that was no small thing for a little girl of 12 or 13 who was only a child herself. I was in shock and unable to think clearly. Considerations of what this was all about ran through my whole being, mixed with terror and fear. The picture of a little girl with hair that was partly stuck to tree roots floating underwater kept coming before my eyes. Her whole body swayed with the flow of water like a kite in the wind, completely at its mercy. And that face, lifeless and pale, the sight came back to me as nightmares later. Perhaps it was this event that caused me to stay away from swimming places, and at some point later I noticed that I had completely lost my desire to swim. Had I been to swimming classes so that God could use me to save this girl's life? Is everything in our lives carefully pre-planned? Or am I somehow different to other people? These thoughts kept coming from somewhere, entering my mind out of the blue. So who am I then? A few days passed, and the atmosphere of turmoil surrounding this event settled. The girl's parents apologized to me for their false accusation. The girl had told them exactly what had happened, and the accused became the heroine. The girl's mother called me over, and she said she was sorry for her rash behavior, but the shock of seeing her only child lifeless in my arms had been so great. When the girl had recovered, she had told them how everything had happened and how bravely I had saved her from certain drowning. Peace returned to my heart, and self-accusation gave way to great joy. I was even rewarded with a handsome 50 zloty coin for my bravery. Down the years, the girl often reminisced on the event, and thankfulness beamed from her face. Everything returned to normal with the exception of my approach to swimming and water. Swimming was no longer a thing for me. This experience left me with a trauma that prevented me from going in water where I couldn't see the bottom. My parents worked hard, and the work produced results. Dad was proud that we were the first in the village to be able to afford mod cons. We had the first TV, the first tractor, the first gas stove, etc. It was no wonder that the neighbors often came to our house to watch TV programs. In the evenings, the women would sit down to clean goose feathers and down. They were made into pillows and covers. We kids helped as we could. The men would often sit with a bottle of liquor, playing cards and planning the next jobs or the slaughter of an animal, things that were always done together with the neighbors. I loved watching TV, and we watched it a lot whenever we had time. We usually had to do our homework quickly after school and then help with the home and farm work and with the business. Sometimes we would stay indoors longer and open the television. Some children's program would be on, but then we would hear Dad calling, "Where are you? Get to work fast!" But it was an exciting bit in the program, and we wanted to see what would happen, and then the electricity would go out. We went to see what had caused the electricity to fail, and it was Dad. He had taken the fuse out. Then there was nothing for it but to start carrying sawdust or making apple boxes or help Dad with cutting and honing planks. The evening was once again far spent, and tiredness made us all fall into bed directly after supper and a wash. Often we had to go to the shop early in the morning. "We're out of bread and flour because I baked for the weekend," Mum would say. Our parents would explain, "You need to go to the mill with some wheat, but tomorrow you need to go to the shop. They might have some bread and maybe something else that we can buy with a coupon." And they would wake us up early. And we went to join the queue. Mum often queued for things too. Sometimes you were able to get something, sometimes not. After going to the shop, we went to school. The school was on the other side of the river, and I attended that school for the first 6 years. For 7th and 8th grade, I went to a larger school on a school bus that picked us up early in the morning.